The meadow of second chances. Henry Walker was 71, though most mornings he felt far older. His joints ached with the stubbornness of old iron hinges, and his back had begun to bow slightly, as if gravity had claimed a small victory each year. He lived on the edge of a quiet town, in a weathered house with peeling paint, in a yard that looked perpetually half-finished. His only true companion was a shaggy mutt named Buddy. The dog was brown and white, with mismatched ears, and a way of looking at Henry that suggested he understood everything. The loneliness, the sighs, the long pauses over morning coffee. Buddy kept Henry moving, forcing him out of the house at least twice a day for walks along the cracked sidewalks or down the narrow path that led to the forest. Life had narrowed for Henry. Once he had been a carpenter, strong-armed and sure-footed, building tables and porches, repairing roofs, creating things that lasted. But since his retirement 10 years ago, his tools had gathered dust. Days blurred together into a pattern of breakfast, newspapers, chores he delayed, and evenings in front of the television. He still cooked for himself, though the meals were simple: scrambled eggs, boiled potatoes, a sandwich if he felt ambitious. His neighbor across the street, Margaret Lane, was 62. She had moved into the pale yellow house 2 years earlier after losing her husband. Henry sometimes watched her tend her small garden, trimming roses or carrying bags of soil. She carried herself with quiet dignity, though her shoulders sloped as if the weight of the years pressed down on her. They exchanged greetings, "Good morning," "Lovely day," but nothing more. Henry often wondered if she felt the same dullness he did, the same lack of spark. One gray afternoon, Henry clipped Buddy's leash and stepped outside. The air was damp from last night's rain, the sky low and heavy. They followed the usual route toward the woods. Buddy tugged more than usual, nose to the ground, tail wagging with a secret excitement. "Slow down, old boy," Henry muttered, tightening his grip. But Buddy broke free, the leash slipping from Henry's arthritic fingers. "Buddy," Henry called, his voice echoing among the trees. The dog bounded ahead, disappearing into the undergrowth. Henry swore under his breath and followed, his knees protesting with each step. The forest felt different that day, darker, thicker, as if it wanted to swallow him whole. He pushed through branches, calling the dog's name, until suddenly the trees opened. Henry stumbled onto a clearing he had never seen before. It was a meadow, perfectly round, bathed in a golden light that seemed to come from nowhere. The grass shimmered as though each blade had been brushed with morning dew and starlight at once. The air was warm yet crisp, carrying a scent of wildflowers and something else. Something clean and electric, like the first breath after a storm. Buddy sat in the middle of the clearing, tongue lolling happily, as if he had been waiting for Henry all along. Henry stopped short, his chest heaving. He felt the air against his skin, and something shifted. His shoulders straightened, the ache in his knees loosened. He took a breath, deep, full, the kind he hadn't managed in years, and it felt as though his lungs belonged to a much younger man. The light danced across his vision, wrapping around him like a second skin. He stretched his arms, astonished that the stiffness had melted away. For the first time in decades, Henry jogged, actually jogged, toward Buddy. His legs carried him with ease, each step firm and sure. He laughed. It startled him. The sound was rich and vibrant, not the thin chuckle he had grown used to. Buddy barked in response, circling with excitement. Henry turned in place, taking in the meadow. It was impossible. He had walked these woods for years, yet he had never seen this clearing. And that light, it wasn't sunlight, not really. It pulsed softly, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Henry couldn't tell. The air hummed around him, filling him with a strength he thought was long gone. His mind, too, felt sharper, clearer. Ideas he hadn't entertained in years flickered alive. Unfinished projects, books he had meant to read, words he had wanted to say. Finally, Buddy trotted to the edge of the meadow, tail wagging as if urging Henry to follow. Reluctantly, Henry stepped back into the trees. The golden glow faded, replaced by the gray dimness of the forest. The stiffness crept back into his joints, though not as heavily as before. he still felt lighter, stronger, as if he carried some of the meadow inside him. When they reached home, Henry paused at his porch, gazing across the street. Margaret was kneeling among her roses, gloves dirt-stained, hair loose around her face. For a moment, he imagined walking over, offering to help with her garden. He imagined smiling, not the polite, tired smile, but a real one. Something had changed. He didn't know what the meadow was or why it had appeared. But as Buddy settled by his feet and the evening light stretched across the street, Henry felt a certainty he hadn't known in years. His life was not finished. Henry woke the next morning before dawn, surprised to find himself alert. Usually waking up was a sluggish affair. He would roll to the edge of the bed, stretch against the ache in his spine, and shuffle toward the kitchen. But that morning, his body felt different, lighter somehow, as though he had shed a layer of fatigue during the night. Buddy stirred at the foot of the bed, ears flicking. "Come on, old boy," Henry said, his voice stronger than he expected. "Let's see what today brings." The kitchen smelled of coffee and toast soon enough, and Henry caught himself humming, actually humming, as he buttered the bread. He hadn't hummed in years. When he glanced out the window, the morning light caught Margaret in her yard again. She wore a faded blue sweater and bent carefully over her roses, trimming the stems. Henry hesitated, toast halfway to his mouth. He'd lived across from Margaret for 2 years and had never gone further than polite greetings. But now he felt restless, almost daring. The meadow's glow seemed to linger in him, whispering, "Do something. Say something." He spent the morning around the house. The gutters had been clogged for months, but instead of sighing at the task, he pulled out his ladder. To his amazement, climbing felt natural, even steady. He cleaned the gutters, swept the porch, even replaced a loose shutter. By noon, he had accomplished more than he usually did in a week. "Not bad for an old man," he muttered, chuckling. Buddy wagged his tail as if in agreement. Later that afternoon, Henry found himself standing at the edge of Margaret's yard. He wasn't entirely sure how he had ended up there. One minute he was trimming his hedge. The next he was watching her struggle with a heavy bag of soil. "Need a hand with that?" he asked. Margaret looked up, startled. A strand of gray hair clung to her cheek. "Oh, Henry, isn't it?" "No, I couldn't trouble you." "It's no trouble," he said quickly, stepping forward. He lifted the bag with ease, surprising even himself. He carried it to the base of her rose bushes and set it down gently. Margaret removed her gloves, brushing her hands against her sweater. "Thank you. You didn't have to." Henry shrugged. "Well, it's been a while since I felt useful." He offered a small grin. Something flickered in her eyes. Not quite amusement, not quite curiosity. "You look different today." Standing straighter, Henry laughed softly. "Must be the weather." He didn't dare mention the meadow. Not yet. How could he explain it? They spoke a little longer, about the roses, the weather, the way the town had changed. Nothing profound. Yet Henry walked back to his house with a strange flutter in his chest. It wasn't exactly romance. It was possibility. And that was more than he'd felt in years. That evening, he cooked a proper meal for the first time in a long while. Roast chicken, carrots, and potatoes. The house filled with the scent, and Henry felt oddly proud, as if proving something to himself. After dinner, instead of collapsing into his chair, he took Buddy for another walk, heading deliberately toward the forest. The path was familiar, yet his pulse quickened as he drew nearer to where he'd found the meadow. But when he reached the same spot, the trees remained unbroken, the clearing nowhere in sight. He frowned. "Strange, huh, Buddy?" The dog sniffed the ground, tail wagging, but there was no golden glow, no shimmering grass. For a moment, disappointment stabbed him, but then he realized he still felt stronger, more alive. Whatever had happened yesterday, it had stayed with him. Over the next week, the change continued. Henry rose earlier, worked longer, and discovered forgotten pleasures. The smell of freshly cut wood, the rhythm of hammer against nail, the satisfaction of fixing what was broken. He dusted off his old tools and began building a birdhouse, his hands moving with a skill he thought he had lost. Margaret noticed. One afternoon, she leaned over the fence as he sanded a piece of pine. "That looks lovely. You're quite handy." "Used to be." Henry said, wiping his brow. Guess it doesn't fade completely. You remind me of my husband, she said quietly. He built me a bench once. It's still in the garden. Henry nodded, sensing the weight behind her words. Maybe I could fix it up for you sometime. She smiled, faint but real. I'd like that. The days rolled on, and Henry began to look forward to their small conversations. Sometimes he carried over fresh vegetables from the market. Sometimes she offered him tea. There was a gentleness to it, an unspoken understanding between two people who had both weathered storms. Yet at night when Henry lay in bed, he thought of the meadow. He thought of the light, the breath of air that had filled his lungs like fire. And he wondered, was it real, or was it some dream born from loneliness? Buddy would nuzzle close, as if reminding him it had been no dream at all. One evening, Henry found himself standing at his window, watching Margaret water her garden. The sun had dipped low, painting the street in gold. For the first time in decades, Henry thought, maybe this isn't the end of the road. Maybe it's the beginning. The weeks rolled by, and Henry felt younger than he had in decades. His days were filled with projects, fixing things around the house, tending to his yard, and most importantly, finding excuses to cross paths with Margaret. She seemed to notice the change, though she never asked directly. Sometimes Henry caught her watching him with a puzzled, almost wistful expression. Yet little by little, he began to notice something unsettling. The boundless energy he had felt after that first visit to the meadow started to ebb. It wasn't sudden, but one morning his knees ached again when he got out of bed. Another day he felt winded after carrying groceries. The lightness inside him was dimming, as though the gift were fading. He tried to brush it off, telling himself he was simply overexerting, but deep down, he knew better. One cool evening, as Henry sat on the porch watching the last glow of sunlight slip behind the trees, Buddy trotted to his side. The dog whined softly, ears pricked toward the forest. Henry frowned. What is it, boy? Buddy whined again, then padded a few steps toward the edge of the yard before looking back expectantly. A strange shiver ran through Henry. He stood, joints stiff, and followed. The dog moved with purpose, nose low to the ground, weaving through the familiar streets until they reached the forest trail. Henry's pulse quickened. Could it be? They walked deeper, Buddy tugging him along, until the path twisted, and there it was. The meadow, the same clearing, bathed in that shimmering golden light, grass swaying as if alive. Henry inhaled sharply. So it wasn't just once. Buddy barked, tail wagging furiously, and bounded into the glow. Henry stepped after him. The moment his feet touched the grass, the air surged into his lungs, clean and warm, filling him with a strength he thought he had lost again. His back straightened, his breath came easy, and the ache melted from his body. He laughed aloud, the sound startling the birds from the trees. Oh, Buddy, you found it again. He knelt, ruffling the dog's fur with gratitude. You're the key, aren't you? Without you, I'd never have found this place. Buddy licked his hand as if agreeing. Henry stayed for a while, walking slowly across the meadow, savoring the sensation. The sunlight here wasn't like ordinary sunlight. It shimmered with a faint, otherworldly glow, as if each beam carried a secret. When he closed his eyes, he felt 30 again, his heart racing with possibilities. But when he finally returned home, he realized something else. The meadow wasn't just a miracle, it was a responsibility. The gift wasn't permanent. It required returning, like tending a flame that would otherwise die out, and he could only reach it if Buddy led him. Over the following months, Henry lived with this new rhythm. When he felt himself tiring, when the old weight threatened to return, Buddy would somehow know. The dog would nudge him, whine at the door, and guide him back into the forest. Each visit restored him, kept him young. But Henry told no one, not even Margaret, especially not Margaret. Yet the meadow's influence changed more than his body. It changed his spirit. He began to take Margaret out for walks around the neighborhood, offering his arm as they strolled beneath blooming dogwoods. He fixed her garden bench just as he'd promised, sanding it smooth and painting it a rich oak brown. When he delivered it, she touched the wood as though it were something precious. You didn't have to do this, she said softly. Maybe I wanted to, Henry replied, and the way she smiled made his heart skip. Still, he sometimes caught himself staring at her, wondering what it would mean to share the secret of the meadow. He longed to see her as vibrant as he now felt, her laughter full and unburdened. But could he bring her there? Would the meadow accept another? One late afternoon, after returning glowing from another visit, Henry found Margaret standing at his gate with a plate of cookies. She looked at him closely, her brow furrowed. "You've changed so much," she murmured. "There's a spring in your step, a light in your eyes. I don't understand it." Henry hesitated, caught between truth and silence. At last, he simply said, "Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it." Margaret tilted her head, her eyes soft. "Then maybe I need one of those chances too." The words stayed with him long after she had gone. That night, as Buddy curled at his feet, Henry whispered, "One day, boy. One day we'll bring her with us." Buddy's ears twitched as if in agreement. For now, though, the meadow remained their secret, a hidden gift, a flame to keep alive until the time was right. The change in Henry grew more visible with each passing week. He felt lighter, more alive, as though the meadow had peeled away decades of weariness. But the most surprising gift wasn't just his renewed strength. It was the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years, creativity. One quiet evening, as he sat on the porch with Buddy at his feet, his mind drifted back to his youth, to long summer nights in the late 60s, when he and his friends would gather in a garage, strumming guitars, singing Beatles songs until their voices cracked. He remembered the calluses on his fingers, the thrill of playing Yesterday to a girl he once adored. He hadn't touched a guitar in years, not since Marjorie had passed. But now the memory didn't ache, it sparked. "I think I could still play," he muttered. Buddy thumped his tail as if urging him on. The idea grew until Henry couldn't ignore it. He wanted to play again, not just for himself, but for Margaret. She had been kind, curious, watching him with those soft eyes, and he longed to show her the joy that now bubbled inside him. So one Saturday evening, Henry asked Margaret if she'd like to go with him to the little café downtown, the kind of place where retirees gathered, sipping coffee while old rock and roll records played faintly in the background. She agreed, surprised but pleased, and they strolled together under the fading glow of streetlights. The cafe was cozy, its walls decorated with vintage posters, Elvis, the Rolling Stones, a faded photograph of Woodstock, and there, hanging on the wall as decoration, was a dusty acoustic guitar. Henry's heart skipped. It was like fate itself had set the stage. They found a small corner table, ordered coffee and pie. Margaret seemed content, but her eyes followed Henry's gaze to the guitar. "You used to play, didn't you?" she asked softly. Henry smiled sheepishly. "A long time ago." "Then why are you looking at it like it's calling your name?" He laughed, nerves buzzing. "Because maybe it is." Before doubt could creep in, Henry stood, crossed the room, and lifted the guitar from its hook. The cafe owner gave him a curious look, then waved a hand. "Go on, old-timer. Let's see if you remember how." The instrument was worn, the strings slightly rusted, but as Henry strummed the first chord, it was as if no time had passed. His fingers found their places naturally, muscle memory awakening from its long slumber. He began to play Norwegian Wood by the Beatles, the haunting melody filling the cafe. The room fell quiet. Conversations faded, spoons clinked softly in cups. Margaret's eyes widened, her lips parting as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Henry's voice, though rougher than in his youth, carried warmth and sincerity. Each note seemed to shimmer with the same strange vitality that flowed through him from the meadow. For those few minutes, he wasn't 71. He was 30 again, playing for a woman whose smile lit up his world. When the final chord lingered in the air, the cafe erupted in gentle applause. Someone whistled. The owner chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess the old guitar still had some life left in her." Henry lowered the instrument, cheeks flushed. But all he saw was Margaret, clapping softly, her eyes shining with admiration. "That was beautiful," she whispered when he returned to their table. "I never knew you could do that." "Neither did I," Henry admitted with a grin. "At least, not anymore." They sipped their coffee in companionable silence, though Henry's heart still raced. He felt alive in a way he hadn't in decades, not only because of the meadow's gift, but because he had shared a piece of himself with someone who mattered. When they left the cafe, Margaret slipped her hand into his arm. It wasn't a bold gesture, but it was enough to send warmth surging through him. "Maybe next time," she said with a playful smile, "you'll play something just for me." Henry chuckled, his spirit soaring. "You name the song, and it's yours." As they walked home beneath the stars, Buddy trotting happily beside them, Henry knew the meadow had given him more than youth. It had given him courage, the courage to let someone new into his heart. When they reached Margaret's gate, Henry hesitated, not wanting the evening to end. She lingered too, one hand still resting lightly on his arm. Buddy gave an impatient bark, as if urging them onward. "Looks like he wants a longer walk," Margaret said with a smile. Henry chuckled. "He's always had more sense than I do." So they walked a little farther, down the quiet street where the lamps glowed amber and the cicadas hummed in the hedges. Their steps fell into rhythm, and the silence between them was easy, companionable. When they finally turned back, Henry realized something. He didn't want this to be a one-time stroll. The next evening after supper, he knocked gently on her door. "Care to join us?" he asked, Buddy wagging at his side. She laughed, slipped on her light jacket, and together they walked beneath the stars again. One evening turned into two, then three. Soon it was their quiet tradition, Margaret, Henry, and Buddy strolling through the neighborhood at dusk, the air cooling, the world softening into night. Sometimes Henry would hum the tunes he had once played on the guitar, and Margaret would tease him to sing louder. Other times they simply listened to the rustle of leaves, the rhythm of their footsteps, and the steady, faithful panting of Buddy leading the way. With every walk, the bond between them deepened. The meadow had given Henry his strength back, but these walks gave him something else, something he hadn't dared to hope for: companionship, blooming gently into love.